Thank you for joining us today, both in person and virtually. Good afternoon. We are now midweek through Genocide Awareness Week. This is a week-long event seeking to address how we, as a global society, confront violent actions and current and ongoing threats of genocide and related mass atrocity crimes throughout the world, while also looking to the past for guidance and to honor those affected by genocide. We are grateful to the Rosenbluth Family Charitable Foundation for their generosity in sponsoring this educational opportunity. My name is Judy Searle. I am the daughter of Sally and Barry Rosenbluth and granddaughter of Raphael Minarski, all of whom were Holocaust survivors. May their memories be for a blessing. As a former president of the Phoenix Holocaust Association and as a member of the GAW Community Advisory Board, it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Alex Alvarez is a professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Northern Arizona University. From 2001 to 2003, he was the founding director of the Martin Springer Institute for Teaching the Holocaust, Tolerance, and Humanitarian Values. In 2017 to 2018, he served as the Ida E. King Distinguished Visiting Scholar in Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Stockton University. His books include Governments, Citizens, and Genocide, Murder American Style, Violence, the Enduring Problem, Genocidal Crimes, Native America and the Question of Genocide, and his latest book, Unstable Ground, Climate Change, Conflict, and Genocide. Please welcome Dr. Alvarez.
Thank you for that introduction, Judy. I appreciate it. All around us, and it continues to shape and guide us as individuals, as communities, and as nations. And the identities we construct come from our history. They come from our past. They come from our experiences. But we need to remember that the past is mutable. We remember selectively, and we create stories and narratives out of past events and experiences about who we are. And at the national level, our identity is largely something we create out of shared stories about where we come from, what we've done, and what we stand for. Yet, as many suggest, that national identity is often nothing but a myth that we all agree upon. Now, I start with this because it feels as if many nations around the world are currently engaged in debates, often violent debates, about who and what they are. And that's certainly the case for us here in the United States. There was an op-ed, I think it was about a year and a half ago, in the New York Times when Roger Cohen wrote that, quote, "In moments of national fragility, history rears its head. The past becomes a vast storehouse of grievance. Revived memory is manipulated to produce violent nationalism." This is what is happening today in the United States, a nation suddenly at war with its past. And what he was writing about were all of the marches and rallies, at demonstrations and counter demonstrations in regard to our confronting our history in regards to slavery, the Civil War, the lost cause, and these kind of issues. But I wanted to start with this because as I speak about the rise of Nazism in Germany, the resulting cataclysms of the Second World War and the Holocaust, and the critical role that nationalism and a particular kind of nationalism played in facilitating the crimes of the Nazis, I want you to think about the relevance of such historic events and processes for our time and place. While we cannot ignore events such as the German defeat in the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles, and the resentments that it bred, the post-war revolutionary violence that racked many German cities for years in the aftermath of the war, or the hardship, the fear, and the anxiety produced by the Great Depression, We must also acknowledge and understand the profound influence played by a variety of intertwined belief systems that largely shaped how these events were perceived, interpreted, and reacted to. The years after the First World War were a time when many European nations experienced a dramatic rise in extreme forms of nationalism. The crucible of the First World War, the first modern industrial and very technological war, had proved a disruption to the institutions of European social, political, ideological, and economic life. With the violent destruction of the old pre-war order and the resulting widespread loss of faith in traditional institutions, parties, and leadership, a variety of radical nationalist parties rose in the disorder and power vacuum posed by those chaotic post-war years. Coupled with the disillusionment of the old established order was a pervasive sense of unease and anxiety provoked by a rapidly changing world in which technology, industry, art, and culture were morphing into new and sometimes unrecognizable and often very uncomfortable forms. Change is always difficult, and this was certainly the case for Europe in the aftermath of World War I. These volatile times proved to be a fertile breeding ground for far-right, radical nationalist movements in places such as Germany, France, Spain, Hungary, Italy, and Romania, among others, as we all know. Now, it's important to note that in the modern era, national identity has been perhaps the most pervasive and powerful means of defining who we are, both individually and collectively. Yet for all of its centrality to the modern sense of community and self, it's a relatively recent invention. The development of the nation state involved organizing populations that were increasingly heterogeneous and dispersed. And this required the creation of a different kind of loyalty and affiliation to what had preceded it. Nationalism. Nation states are comprised of millions of strangers who nonetheless feel a bond with each other built on the belief that they share a common heritage, culture, traditions, and future. But in many ways, it's an invented connection, or what the political scientist Benedict Anderson famously referred to as an imagined community. More recently, the historian Yuval Harari, some of you may be familiar with his work, summarizes it this way. It's an imagined community, or an imagined community is a community of people who don't really know each other, but imagine that they do. Nationalism has consequently played an important part of identity formation in the modern world. And Germany was certainly no exception to this, although a single national identity developed rather late in the German-speaking world compared to many other European countries. What is ironic is that the nationalism that developed in Germany was originally infused with many liberal and progressive values. And while there were certainly reactionary, intolerant, and racist elements to early German nationalism, it was nevertheless fairly inclusive. This inclusive variant of German nationalism, however, was to be fundamentally reconstructed in the years after the First World War, and the primary engine of that change were the Nazis. The Nazi movement was born and ultimately rose to power at a time when German national identity had been badly shaken and battered by defeat in the First World War. For many Germans, losing the war came as a shock and a significant national trauma. Think of it, after years of sacrifice, of suffering, of struggle and hardship, the nation had lost. And to add insult to injury, the Treaty of Versailles, signed at the end of June 1919, imposed high reparation payments, severely limited the size of Germany's armed forces and equipment, stripped territory, and most infuriating of all, required Germany to accept sole responsibility for the war. And to patriotic Germans and nationalists, this was considered a slap in the face. And they blamed the post-war Weimar government for accepting those terms. Theodor Heuss, who would later become the first president of the Federal Republic of Germany in 1949, famously suggested that the cradle of the National Socialist movement was Versailles and not Munich. To add further insult to injury, post-war Germany was in absolute turmoil, with revolutionary violence in a number of German cities and economic deprivation and turmoil. And it was in this climate that the Nazi movement arose both as a reaction and a response to the losses incurred by defeat and the chaos and violence that followed in its wake. From its inception, the message of the Nazis was basically very simple. The Nazis articulated a message highlighting traditional German values and principles, and as they marched, they would sing songs, for example, with lyrics such as the SA, the Sturmabteilung, the brown shirts, is marching for Goethe, for Schiller, for Kant, for Bach, for Köln Cathedral. Now we must work for Goethe with beer mugs and chair legs. And when we have won, well then, we will stretch out our arms once more and press our cultural heritage to our hearts. The attraction of the Nazis was not simply rooted in a yearning for a return to Germany's past. People often long for a return to a vision of simpler times when traditional values and practices dominate and all is familiar and reassuring, but is nonetheless real in its perception of many. We need to remember the sociologist W.I. Thomas's famous dictum that goes along the lines, what is perceived to be real is real in its consequences. And even if this mythic time, this historic time of simplicity and traditional values isn't real, the responses are very, very real. And this longing for an imagined past is never more urgent than when experiencing rapid social change and political and economic insecurity. The Nazis appealed to this yearning by espousing a vision of the future in which a resurgent Germany once again was filled with stability, economic opportunity, and pride. And the means by which this was to be intended to be achieved was through the creation of a people's community or a Volksgemeinschaft. And this message appealed to wide segments of a society hungry for a sense of belonging and community. It's no accident that the Nazi movement emphasized It's no accident that the Nazi movement emphasized uniforms and communal activities such as marches, demonstrations, and mass rallies, because all of them fostered a strong sense of membership and belonging for members of the movement. And in an era of perceived loss and humiliation, the appeal of such a message was seductive. It offered the possibility of a restoration of pride, of traditional values, of law and order, and a heightened sense of meaning, belonging, and identity. But there's a downside to this. Flip such is that at the expense of those, is this microphone cutting in? Just me? Okay. Is that it comes at the expense of those defined as not belonging. Technology is not my friend today. Anyway, what we have to understand is that the flip side of this kind of belonging and community, this nationalism, is that it comes at the expense of those defined as not belonging to the national community, to outsiders, in other words. Nationalism has often been a powerful force for differentiating one's own group from others. Nationalism, in other words, focuses on who is not a member of the national community as much as it focuses on who belongs. To the sociologists out there, the in-group is defined by the out-group in many ways. Nationalism, in other words, as one observer noted, essentially speaks to ideologies of exclusion. And the Nazi brand of German nationalism was no exception to this rule. Even though Jews, for example, had been members of German communities from ancient times, and were among the most assimilated of all of Europe's Jewish populations, they were nonetheless still defined as outsiders by German nationalists. In order to achieve their revitalized folkish community, the Nazis believed that they had to remove anyone who resisted or who simply did not belong because their presence itself constituted a threat to the racial health of the German people. In fact, identifying and then protecting themselves from enemies was not just necessary to achieve greatness, but was also necessary to ensure the very survival of the Germanic people. In the eyes of the Nazis, they were engaged in a life and death struggle that necessitated and justified removing enemies from the social, political, and economic life of the national community. In fact, as early as 1920 in the original Nazi Party platform, they wrote that, quote, only members of the nations may be citizens of the state. Only those of German blood, whatever their creed, may be members of the nation. Accordingly, no Jew may be a member of the nation, unquote. From the very beginning, then, the Nazi movement perceived and defined Jews as existing outside of the body of the nation. In the eyes of the Nazis, Jews and other racial and ethnic groups were alien. They were foreign to the German national community and identity. To the Nazis, if Germany was to survive, let alone resume its rightful place as a world power, the country had to be drastically transformed in accord with some fundamental principles of national identity and race. Race has always played an important role in nationalism. Fascism, including the Nazi variant of this, would take this to an extreme degree. Specifically, the Nazis believed that the German people was engaged in a Darwinian struggle for survival. According to their belief system, the German national and ethnic community was fighting to survive the racial and biological threat presented by inferior peoples, most notably the Jews, whose mere presence threatened not only the purity and superiority of the folk, but its survival as well. And this belief was central to the Nazi worldview, to their interpretation of events. Now, the sociologist Jack Katz points out that a great deal of violence is perceived by its perpetrators as being a type of, quote unquote, righteous slaughter, since it is carried out in order to protect an important value or principle in the eyes of perpetrators. In other words, perpetrators of violence tend to view their actions as an appropriate response to a perceived threat. And such a mindset helps explain the mentality of the Nazis in regard to groups they defined as not belonging and as constituting a threat. Targeted populations from this perspective were seen as posing an existential as well as a biological threat to the purity and well-being of the groups targeting them. The Jews were depicted by the Nazis as being less than human, and their presence in Germany represented a threat to the genetic purity and superiority of the people's community. Furthermore, we have to understand that from this mindset, the actions of the regime weren't arbitrary. They weren't merely a reflection of human fallacy, but rather could be understood as being true to the natural and immutable order of the natural world. It had a force and legitimacy, in other words, that transcended human created rules and policies. It was also a philosophy that did not lend itself to compromise or to half measures. Social Darwinism suggests that life is a constant struggle for survival with no in-between, and consequently encourages radical solutions to such high-stakes conflict. This harsh view of existence actually is something that is common to many authoritarian systems of rule. When combined with the long-standing European-wide anti-Semitism that was also so central to fascist Nazi ideology, the principles of social Darwinism, and for those of you interested, by extension, the practices and policies of eugenics would prove to be catastrophically lethal for Europe's Jewish population. Now, in fairness, I should point out the Nazis did not invent these beliefs. Rather, they subscribed to ideas that were fairly common in many parts of the world. Now, central to the Nazi worldview, as I've just indicated, was the principle of racial purity, a belief that the Aryan people needed to protect their genetic stock from that of lesser racial groups. Now, it's important, and the reason why I highlight this is that it's fundamental to this way of seeing the world is the belief in the inherent inequality of racial groups. Some racial populations, in other words, were defined as being genetically, physically, culturally, and intellectually superior to others. And this was a theme to which Hitler and the Nazis often turned to in speeches and in their writing. And this ideology of eternal and merciless struggle remained a central tenet of the Nazi philosophy and ideology and identity. And it only intensified and further radicalized in the years of the Second World War. In fact, the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 was largely an extension of these same principles. And as was pointed out earlier today, Operation Barbarossa, the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, was perceived as a war of extermination from the very beginning. Lebensraum, or living space, was necessary to ensure the future survival of the German people, and this war was designed to acquire that. Part and parcel was the notion that Bolshevism was the mortal enemy of National Socialism politically, and that the Bolshevik, Jewish, and Slavic populations were the genetic mortal enemy of the Nazis. The war in the East was social Darwinism taken to its ultimate end. In 1942, for example, Hitler gave a speech to army officers in which he asserted that we are all beings of nature, which inasmuch as we can see it only knows one harsh law, the law that gives the right to life to the stronger and takes the life of the weaker. We humans cannot exempt ourselves from this law. And the savage nature of the war on the Eastern Front only served to confirm this iron Darwinian law of life and death struggle. Locked in this titanic struggle against the Soviet Union, the Nazis were essentially fighting a war that was marked by massive destruction, the widespread murder of civilians, and wholesale executions of prisoners on both sides, a reality that has terrible, tragic resonance speaking these lines today. But it was justified in their eyes because it was a life and death struggle for survival. To summarize then very briefly, the violence of the Nazis, World War II, and the Holocaust were as much a consequence of a value and belief system, especially around race and national identity, as they were about the political and economic landscape of Europe in the aftermath of World War I. So, why should we care about the ways in which nationalism in the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s played a role in bringing about the Second World War and facilitating the Holocaust? How is it relevant to us here and now? And the answer actually is unfortunately remarkably simple, because these things are still very much with us. And in fact, all the evidence suggests we have entered an era in which authoritarianism, ethno-nationalism have made significant gains. This authoritarianism, I want to highlight, is often based on very exclusive forms of national identity that emphasize difference. We are today living in a world in which democracy has been on the retreat, a situation summarized by the Nonpartisan Freedom House to quote from one of their recent reports: in every region of the world, democracy is under attack by populist leaders and groups that reject pluralism and demand unchecked power to advance the particular interests of their supporters, usually at the expense of minorities and other perceived foes. Think of the situation in Russia and the Ukraine. Think of Belarus. Think of China and the treatment of the Uyghurs, or the suppression of rights in Hong Kong. Think of Myanmar and the Rohingya minority there. If these ring a bell, you know what I'm talking about. We have seen this happening in Turkey under the leadership of Erdogan. After losing a parliamentary majority in 2015, he used the threat of ISIS to rally nationalists, and in snap elections was successful in regaining a parliamentary majority. And then in 2016, he further solidified his hold on power after an unsuccessful coup attempt sought to remove him from office. He reacted by declaring a state of emergency and then closing many news organizations, purging the civil service of 100,000 public officials, and arresting more than 50,000 citizens from all walks of life. In an analogous but less dramatic fashion, Poland has also become much less democratic and more authoritarian in recent years. The far-right Nationalist Law and Justice Party has worked diligently to centralize power, limit the scope and authority of the judiciary, circumvent traditional legislative organs of government, expand the surveillance of private citizens, and muzzle the media. Not content with controlling the present, think about what I started off with in terms of the past. The government has also focused on rewriting the past in ways that accord with certain images, and has even put a number of academics on trial for their scholarship on Polish complicity in the Holocaust. Similar authoritarian processes have also played out in nations such as Hungary under Viktor Orban. In fact, he won again, is that? Okay. As well as Serbia, Montenegro, Egypt, Philippines, among many others. One commentator put it simply when he wrote, "It has been a good decade for dictatorship. Conversely, it has been a terrible decade for democracy." Even long-established and ostensibly strong democracies have not been immune to this trend, as a number of Western European nations, such as Germany, Austria, Denmark, Italy, Holland, and France, for example, have experienced a significant rise in popular support for far-right political parties that often espouse extreme nativist, xenophobic, and nationalist agendas. And while these political movements have been guided and shaped by various local concerns and issues, they have also shared an intolerance of outsiders and have invariably stoked anti-immigrant fear and hostility, and all too frequently have incited violence in their individual countries against these vulnerable populations. Britain left the European Union, popularly known as Brexit, in large part due to immigration. 1/3 of those who voted to leave asserted that immigration was the main reason for their vote. Now, while many of the far-right parties that have caused such alarm with their violent rhetoric and their agendas have been kept somewhat in check by more recent elections, the threat posed by a resurgent populism and authoritarianism, I believe, remains extremely worrisome. And even the United States has not been immune to these challenges to its democratic institutions and processes. According to research from the Varieties of Democracy Institute, in recent years, the US has experienced substantial autocratization, in which democratic attributes have been diminished or lost. And in fact, the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, a Swedish-based institute, listed the US for the first time as a backsliding democracy. Further research indicates that in the United States and Europe, popular support for democratic principles and practices have diminished, while support for non-democratic modes of governance have increased. Growing numbers of Western Europeans and Americans, in other words, are critical of the messy process of liberal democracy as a form of government and increasingly supportive of more authoritarian rule. These populist sentiments appear to be directly related to increased rates of violence directed at those groups perceived by some as others, as outsiders, as not belonging. And as a result, as will be discussed tomorrow, and I encourage you to come to some of the presentations and panels tomorrow on hate crime and anti-Semitism, we have seen dramatic spikes in these kinds of criminal activities, both in the United States and in many other places around the world. Hate crimes, anti-immigrant violence, and other forms of intolerance, prejudice, and violent conflict are at record levels in many nations, including the US. Moreover, this pandemic, and I hesitate to say this recent pandemic, which implies that it's over, it feels like it's one of those things that, yeah, we'll see. Anyway, the pandemic has accelerated this tendency in various locales, as we have seen a number of political leaders exploiting the COVID-19 pandemic to accelerate the dismantling of democratic institutions and constraints, and to crack down on political and social dissent, such as Chinese authorities have done in Hong Kong, for example. The pandemic has also amplified existing social, political, racial, and religious schisms that have resulted in extremists targeting religious minorities, militants and terrorists ramping up their violence against immigrants and ethnic minority communities, and amplifying existing conflicts such as civil wars, insurgencies, and so forth. And I highlight this recent drift towards exclusionary nationalism, populism, and authoritarian since, in my opinion, it is a situation tailor-made for the development of violent repression and persecution. When states consolidate power within a small group of elites and curtail legal rights and protections, persecution and repression become much easier. Simply put, there are few to no institutional and structural checks on the unbridled exercise of power. Authoritarian states also often tend to be more extreme and radical in their approaches to problems, and are particularly dangerous when the national community is narrowly defined to include only members of a particular racial, ethnic, or religious group. In these locations, minority populations defined as outsiders or newcomers, especially those as portrayed as posing a threat or competing for scarce resources or jobs, are particularly vulnerable to various kinds of persecution and violence. And this is especially true in places where there's a history of intolerance and persecution. Old prejudices often gain new resonance during difficult circumstances. Popular fear and prejudice can relatively easily germinate into persecution, violent conflict, and even into more radical programs of expulsion and even extermination. History teaches us that there always seem to be political and social leaders willing to exploit and use such feelings in order to scapegoat minorities, retain or regain power, to implement more repressive policies, especially against vulnerable or unpopular groups. For these sorts of reasons, an increasingly authoritarian world poses, I would argue, some very real dangers for persecution, for xenophobia, and many forms of violence, including genocide. The lessons of the past generally, and the lessons of the Holocaust in particular, still have much to teach us about such processes. Let me end with the words of someone I'm guessing many of you are familiar with, the words of Primo Levi, who once wrote, "Few countries can be considered immune to a future tide of violence generated by intolerance, lust for power, economic difficulties, religious or political fanaticism, and racialist attritions. It is therefore necessary to sharpen our senses, distrust the prophets, the enchanters, those who speak and write beautiful words, unsupported by intelligent reasons." And with that, I will say thank you for your attention, for listening, and I will entertain any questions you might have. I know, I'm a real downer. This is why I don't get invited to parties.
I'll get us started. You gave a wonderful summary of the story, but especially let's talk about the United States today. Why have our institutions collapsed? Look at what's going in terms of the democratic process. Look at what's going in the Senate, for example. It's not that people don't know what's going on, yet they're participating, they are facilitating, they are complicit in the very breakdown of American democracy. The question is why?
Well, a couple of responses to that. One, I would challenge your starting point to say that our processes have collapsed. I would not say that at all. I would say they've certainly been strained, they've certainly been weakened, and we have seen a dramatic erosion. But as we are seeing, they are still working somewhat. I see it kind of similar to all of our institutions around the pandemic, where we look upon all of those who've succumbed to misinformation and to have hijacked and exploited Holocaust symbols to resist mandates and vaccines and so forth. But we also don't pay attention to the fact that people are out there every day risking their lives to help others, and that the communities, as strained, as stressed as they've been, have held. And I would suggest we are in that same situation. I would also suggest that the answer to your question in terms of why have so many Americans been willing to embrace the destruction of these processes and policies, there are many reasons for it. And in fact, some of those will be addressed in the panel tomorrow. One of the participants is here, Dr. Ronette Bachman, who's going to talk about what we understand about hate crime and anti-Semitism and so forth. But essentially, we are living at a time of profound change. We are living at a time when the world around us is changing in front of our very eyes, and there's a lot of uncertainty and anxiety. I would argue it's also about perceived loss of power and the ways in which these the things that are happening around people are just very, very disquieting. And so what we've seen in recent years has been a dramatic rise in various groups that are often all about racially defined notions of American identity. We're seeing, for example, the Southern Poverty Law Center has documented a dramatic rise in white supremacist, nativist kinds of organizations around the country. So, we could spend a whole hour talking about all of those different kind of processes. And I keep feeling like I'm putting in plugs for tomorrow, but some of those issues I'm guessing will be addressed. Yeah, I don't know if that gets it all to what you were.
You're not putting the onus on the leadership of the United States on various levels, within the Senate, within the House, the leadership has to do more in order to address the processes that we all understand.
I do understand that. And I'm not trying to tap dance around it. I'm trying not to step on, I'm not trying to take away any of the thunder from tomorrow's presentations around some of these issues. But I will say this, yes, part of the issue is that there are those who have very visible voices who at the touch of a thumb or finger or whatever on social media are able to spread certain kind of messages. And whether they actually believe some of what they're saying or whether they are simply using it as a vehicle for advancement, I'll leave that for you to decide. But I would also suggest, without a receptive audience, those ideas, those notions of loss of a certain kind of identity that is under threat from immigrants, from changing demographic compositions, without people who are able to hear that, those words wouldn't work. But they are working. There are significant portions of our population here in the US that have subscribed to notions of, for example, white great replacement theory, white genocide, these kind of things, that it's now being even expressed on very popular television shows at night. I'm thinking of Tucker Carlson and him talking about this. It's important to note that, for example, some of the shooters, the shooter at the Tree of Life Synagogue, the Chabad of Poway, the Christchurch mosque shooter in New Zealand, all subscribe to this notion of great replacement. We are at a moment in time where there is a lot of change and fear and anxiety about it. And this is what I was trying to hopefully make a bit of a connection from the past to the current era as well.
Thank you. Hello. Okay. I'm curious about revisionism and
Methodological?
Yes, that's always a hard one for me. So I understand that currently Russia and Poland are engaged in Holocaust revisionism in the sense that we didn't participate the way, the past suggests, or historians have written about. I'm curious more about, first, the impetus for this. Is it that because generations have grown up with a narrative, and so I'm curious specifically about the Holocaust, is given that there is so much evidence, how does one really, how do such movements actually gather mass when, I'm a student, I suppose, but there's nothing but libraries and repositories of evidence. So I guess I'm curious, what is the general,
where do they come from? How do they work? Kind of.
Yes. And what is their claim in the sense of how do they manage to persist?
Well, there's no one answer to that, right? And as one of the things I just briefly alluded to, all of these processes take on local flavors, right? They respond to local particularities and so forth, even falling within some general kinds of themes or trends. And so it varies. So I would argue, for example, if you look at Turkey and the Turkish government's denial of the Armenian genocide, you have to understand that modern Turkish national identity is built on a certain image of itself. And if you're to acknowledge that it's built upon genocide, that actually strikes at the very legitimacy of your identity as a people. In many ways, if we look at what's going on in Poland, in Belarus, in Lithuania, and others, their construction of their idea of themselves as being victimized by the Nazis runs counter at some level to the reality of, for some, collaboration, complicity, and these kind of things. What I think it was Orwell, wasn't, who said, "He who controls the past controls the future," right? So if you are wanting to control the future, ideas about who you are and where you come from, you create narratives that speak a certain story about your identity as a people. And so part of what's going on is trying to dismiss or supplant a certain version of history with another one, a mythic idea about who you are as a people. And this is something that people want. They want to feel good about this identity that is critical to their sense of self and community. And that's what these leaders in various countries are exploiting and building upon. I don't know, does that help answer at all?
It does. I guess I'm curious then at the case study why it might appear that Germany was able to, you know, at least so many years later appear as a nation state to have embraced the process. And you know, it's whereas some are just, oh no, but never others. So, you know, culturally,
There are so many factors. So, you know, has Germany confronted its past in a way that other countries have not? I could probably get into a debate about this with Volker, I'm guessing, around how successfully it has done so. But we do see difference when we look at Germany, for example, and Austria, and the ways in which they have created a modern identity that emphasizes or that minimizes certain aspects of its history. We also have to understand culture and identity are fluid. They're constantly changing and evolving. And so the German national identity of today is not that which it was 10 years ago, 50 years ago, or even earlier. And in fact, one of the biggest things I'm seeing is the way in which Germany is asserting itself in a way today because of the situation in Ukraine that was unthinkable even 10 years ago, right? We construct ideas about who we are, what we value, what we stand for. And part of that is built upon our idea of this shared history. And the more you can control that, the more you can control that identity about who you are as a people. And that's why, for example, in the United States, part of this, great debate, this discussion of who we are, is around not just slavery and racism, but also about our history in regards to Native America, right? That's why we're seeing all of these things happening in many communities around books and libraries or the teaching of critical race theory and so forth, because it's about what identity are we constructing? Who are we as a people? And for the first time, I would suggest in a long time, we are more honestly confronting it than we had for a very long period of time. And that's really uncomfortable for some. Everything that's familiar and safe is suddenly being called into question, right? Complicated issues, but great questions. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Professor Alvarez, for a really stimulating conversation and bringing together so many different things. I don't so much have a question, but a small response or suggestion. I think one important component you haven't considered in the analysis you presented today is the powerful role that companies, large, massive corporations who make their money off of offering so-called free services to all of us, are having on what people consume, think, feel, believe about themselves in the world. I'm talking about Meta, Facebook. I'm talking about Alphabet and Google. They're the two largest companies who offer us so-called free services in exchange for access to all of our data. All of us who have smartphones in this room, which is probably 100%, we've all clicked on user agreements that allow our phones to listen to everything we're doing. That allows us to collect data off the people whose other phones are near us, so they know who we're interacting with electronically. So that includes now Apple. We've done that. Amazon has moved into the space as well through Alexa. And I think we discount or underestimate the power this is having on our own individual decision-making, but also the directions our society's going. For instance, every time you type into the Google everything bar at the top, it suggests where you're it suggests what you're searching for. And I do it all the time. I click, yeah, that's what I'm looking for. But they collect that data. And so they know what I've searched for in the past. And then they push their information to me. Worse though, They collect that information and they now sell it. They sell it to other companies, but they also sell it to think tanks, political parties, political campaigns, and these have all played roles in our recent elections. And so we're all complicit in this undermining of democratic principles in our society. It's not just the leaders. Granted, Mitch McConnell has destroyed the rule of law in the Senate with many things he's done. Some Democrats inched it that way before him, though. But it's these corporations who are controlling all of this information and are able to influence us in really powerful ways that we don't even recognize.
Great comments. Thank you, Jenny. Excellent comments. I actually, part of the difficulty in a presentation such as this is thinking about what to include, what to exclude. Certainly the role of technology, corporations, media, social media in fostering certain narratives or silencing others. Absolutely. We could also talk about globalization and economic systems of exploitation, right? Think about colonialism and all of these. There are so many areas we could go. And part of my struggle was in trying to shape this coherent, if it was at all, presentation is where do you exclude, where do you include? And I went in terms of kind of broad brushstrokes. But absolutely, there are a lot of forces at play, some of which we're very aware of or we focus on, others that are much more hidden. And I think you're absolutely right. There's nobody with clean hands in an unclean world, right? At some level, all of us are complicit in these arrangements, in these systems that are exploitative or that foster certain kinds of processes. I can't tell you how often I talk with friends who they teach about these issues, all these kind of different things, and then at every break they're on Facebook. And I'm like, well, there's a bit of a disconnect there, right? And I don't know that I have the answer either, right? I'm also part of this as well, but I think maybe what helps me is recognizing that the more aware of these kind of things we are, the more intentional and conscious we are in terms of how we interact, teach, educate, write, or support certain things versus others. I think, hopefully, it'll in the collective make some difference. We'll see. If not, there's always wine. I don't know.
In your experience, do these authoritarian tendencies crop up more in societies that are culturally homogenous or culturally heterogeneous?
Well, so what we are seeing is that very often, especially in homogenous societies, it's very easy to have a national identity that is inclusive because everyone's very much the same, right? But what we are seeing in many places, as the demographics are shifting in many places around the world, that those kinds of stressors, those kind of changes, some are reacting to it by adopting this more exclusive kind of national identity, right? And we are seeing these changes happening all over the world. The projections are that the numbers of people who are displaced currently are at record levels around the world. It's something like, I think the UN calculates as something like 70 some odd million people around the world are displaced in various forms by conflicts, by climate change, by other kinds of things. The numbers over the next 30 to 40 years are expected to dwarf what we're seeing now. So think about that. Millions and millions of people are leaving where they're from, going to societies, communities around the world in search of stability, opportunity, safety. Conflict is currently the number one source of displacement. How are they going to be met in these communities, where suddenly people are out and about and are seeing a very different kind of community than from what they grew up in? These are the kinds of forces, I think, that pose certain kinds of risks for the development of nativist, xenophobic kinds of mentalities and leaders willing to exploit that. Yeah, great comment.
Based on your research, is there anything that you're particularly hopeful about or any positive directions that you see?
Not at all. No, actually, I will say, so a lot of my work in recent years, and this work kind of comes out of some of that, is on climate change and the consequences of climate change in terms of directly or indirectly fueling conflict, wars, whether resource wars or other kind, and even genocide. And one of the biggest impacts will be with population displacement. And I would argue displaced populations, whether they are considered refugees or immigrants or IDPs, they are incredibly vulnerable groups of human beings. But actually, I have to say, I am somewhat more hopeful today than I was a number of years ago. It feels like, and I hate to use this academic word that we often use, it feels like we're at an inflection point where when I first began talking about these kind of issues, the disconnect was huge. But increasingly, when I give presentations about some of these issues, people get it because this is now often part of their lived experiences, more and more so. Young people today are very much, I think, more aware and active on these kind of issues, especially around climate change and its consequences, than people of, I like to think of myself as fitting with the younger people, but I'm not, but I see that as hopeful. And actually, I will also say something I commented just a couple of minutes ago. This pandemic has created a huge amount of disruption and dislocation and change around the world. And there are certainly those who have fallen prey to misinformation, to conspiracy thinking, who have resisted mandates or vaccines or these kind of things. But millions of other people have continued to go to work every day and putting their lives in danger. Working in hospitals, schools. Our fabric has been strained, the communal fabric, but it's mostly held. And people have worked together in many communities to help each other, to assist each other. That's hopeful. And if there's any hope to be had, it's in those kind of things.
Alex, this is probably the start of a discussion we're going to keep having on our Friday meetings. So just so you're aware,
Henry is a co-editor.
Yeah,
of the journal
we talk all the time.
We usually spend more time just discussing and debating than working. Actually,
yeah. But this is new. This is new territory, and so I appreciate you opening this up. And I'm going to pose this not so much as a question, but I'm going to take a position. I'm going to mischaracterize what you said and respond to it, and then ask you to respond to what I'm going to say as the next sort of discussion.
Oh boy.
And you're an incredibly subtle thinker. You work on Native Americans, you work on environment. It's always very nuanced, but I'm going to pretend that what I heard was a shading in what you were saying, that crisis, insecurity, fear, those kinds of things are important factors in increasing what we'll call the potential of genocide or the potential of mass violence. I'm not enough of an expert on the Holocaust. I'm not an expert at all on the Holocaust, I should say. So I'm not qualified enough to say this, but I often do wonder, was it really inflation? Was it really the Versailles Treaty that drove the Holocaust? Or are we just taking what perpetrators said to rationalize what they were doing? And actually, maybe even average Germans rationalize what they were doing when what was at stake was something very different. Because if you look at a lot of Nazi ideology, it's about domination and power and superiority, and a kind of like, people think they can kick us around, but we're going to show them we're superior. And I will say, I am enough of an expert on the Armenian genocide to say, often people will say, oh my God, the weakening of an empire, there was fear, there was a loss of 19 Balkan War, there was insecurity, there was the loss of empire and all that. But if you look at what the perpetrators were actually saying and what they were doing, it was about a sense of incredible imperial power, and a kind of godlike right to destroy lesser peoples. And who are peoples? And so the question I want to ask you, or the thing I want to pose is, when we look at what's happening today, and I'm just going to look at white supremacy in the United States for a moment, is that really a function of, we talk about Trump and his base are the very people who are really economically victimized by people like Trump, right? And I'm sorry if I'm taking a political position that people don't like, but if we look at it that way, is it really true that those people are duped, that they're, or is it that they actually are making a judgment that what I really care about is an avenue toward claiming a certain kind of power, racist power, sexist power, heteronormative power, and so forth, which is very much in the center of this. And they're just rationalizing, we're under threat, whatever. But what they're really doing is finding a way to dominate, because that's what they enjoy. That's what they want to do. I'm sorry and I'm sure I mischaracterized you, but.
Okay, and I think we're at time. No, thanks for posing that. It's actually a great kind of question. It makes me think of, I think it's a quote from Neil deGrasse Tyson. I think he said something like, physics is easy. When people get involved, it gets complicated. And the answer to your question is that it depends. My students hate that answer because they always want something definitive, very straightforward. But, what you're suggesting is that there are many factors at work in creating particular outcomes. And something like 30 years of studying different forms of violence has taught me that it is contingent, right? That it's not preordained, it's not predestined, whether we're talking the Holocaust or other forms of violence, that there are various forces that play out in highly situational and contingent kinds of ways. And that in certain pathways, it can lead to extreme outcomes, but it's not that is absolutely what's going to happen, right? And so when we talk about perpetrators also, we often tend to think about genocide and perpetrators and victims and bystanders as these very discrete categories. But the reality is that it's much more fluid than that. It is much more situational than that. As the work of various scholars has shown, not only for the Holocaust, but Lian Fuji with Rwanda and others, people can inhabit multiple kinds of roles. And in fact, their belief systems can vary dramatically from one to the other, or even from one time to the other. This is why it's hard to come up with a one very clear, concise kind of answer, because we're really considering so many different kinds of factors. And I'm not trying to tap dance around it, and I will get you back for this, but that's as good as you're going to get.
No contradiction, because you're talking about apples and oranges. Okay. You're comparing Nazis who are driving the Holocaust in terms of ideology and program with his explanation of why people are voting and supporting them. So in other words, one is a category of people who are driven by ideology to do this, and contingency and lots of other factors. And the other is, why are people supporting this from beyond? And I think these are two different categories of people. And again, it's complicated on both sides, but I think it's two different categories.
And there's never one motivation for anything anybody does. Some are overt, some are clear, some operate on, as we all know, all of you have done things that you later thought, why did I do that? Or what the heck was I thinking? We operate on so many different levels. And that's why we are endlessly writing and studying and so forth without ever coming up with one answer. Did I answer it all?
No, you did a great job.
Okay.
I am just going to disagree, though. If you look at Alvarez and Wallerstein on racism, one of the things they say is racism is a particular kind of theory that's the same all the way down strata in society. And so, and I think what I was asserting is that, in the case of Germans, in the case of Turks and other groups that commit genocide, that there's a consistency there. Like, it's not like people are duped or something.
Why don't we do it?
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Are we at time? Okay. So
Let's-
anyway, great comments, great questions.
Let me ask
Thank
the
you,
last
all of you,
question.
for paying
No?
attention. And I hope the rest of your time is a productive and fruitful one. I won't say I hope you enjoy it, because that always feels so inappropriate, but I do hope you get something out of it. And I do appreciate your taking the time to hear what I had to say. Thank you.